Welcome to History Crossroads, where past meets present, and every story reveals a new path through time.
Picture this. It's 1820, and the most powerful man in Europe is arguing about wallpaper. Napoleon Bonaparte, the same man who once held the fate of nations in his hands, is standing in a cramped, leaky house on a remote island, complaining that the wallpaper is too green and the food too bland. He's gotten fat. His famous bicorn hat now sits on graying hair, and he spends his days bickering with British guards about how many candles he's allowed to burn. But here's what's remarkable. Even here, thousands of miles from the palaces of Paris, exiled on Saint Helena, a rock in the South Atlantic chosen specifically because escape was impossible, Napoleon still refused to see himself as defeated. Every morning, he'd put on that same gray overcoat he wore at his greatest victories. He'd pace the small garden, hands clasped behind his back, muttering about battles and strategies to no one in particular. And when visitors came, he didn't tell them about his aches and pains or his loneliness. Instead, he spun tales of glory, painted himself as a man of destiny, insisted that history would vindicate him. The man who had crowned himself emperor was now reduced to writing his memoirs while rain leaked through his roof. But in his mind, he was still Napoleon the Great. This is what fascinates me about Napoleon. We know him as the conqueror, the military genius, the emperor who reshaped Europe. But strip away the crown and the legend, and what you find is something much more complex and much more human. You find a man driven by insecurities that began in childhood, shaped by love affairs that broke his heart, motivated by a desperate need to prove that the awkward outsider boy from Corsica belonged on the world stage. Today, I want to take you on a journey through Napoleon's life, but not the version you learned in history class. I want to show you Napoleon the man, his fears, his loves, his petty complaints, his moments of tenderness, and yes, his moments of cruelty. Because understanding the human being behind the legend doesn't diminish his historical importance. It makes it more remarkable. Let's start at the beginning, with a boy who never quite felt like he belonged anywhere. Napoleon was born in 1769 in Corsica, just months after France had seized the island from Genoa. Think about what that means. His very birth certificate marked him as neither fully French nor fully independent. His family had minor noble titles, but they lived simply. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer who picked his political battles carefully, while his mother, Letizia, and this is important, was the strongest person in young Napoleon's life. Letizia Bonaparte was tough as nails. She had 13 children, 8 survived, and she ruled that household with an iron fist and a tight purse. She rationed everything: food, candles, affection. She taught her children that hardship was normal and complaint was weakness. Years later, when Napoleon commanded armies, people noticed he still ate like Letizia had taught him. Quickly, without fuss, grateful for whatever was available. He once said, half joking, but entirely serious, that he owed his character more to his mother's discipline than to any teacher. At home, they spoke Corsican. At school, Napoleon learned Italian. French came last, and when he arrived in Paris for military school, that accent immediately marked him as different. Picture this: a 10-year-old boy, shorter and skinnier than his classmates, with olive skin and clothes that weren't quite fashionable enough, struggling with a language that wasn't quite his own. His classmates heard that accent and smelled blood in the water. They called him La Paillonaise, a cruel pun meaning straw nose. Here's what breaks my heart about young Napoleon. He was incredibly intelligent, but he was so lonely. While other boys played together, he buried himself in books. He devoured Plutarch's Lives, writing in his notebook that great men were made by will and by patience. He worshipped Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, but not because he dreamed of conquest. He dreamed of belonging. He dreamed of being great enough that no one could mock his accent or his clothes ever again. The isolation shaped him in ways that would echo through his entire life. He developed this habit of eating quickly and then pacing, hands clasped behind his back, lost in thought. Teachers noticed his fierce temper when insulted, but also his incredible memory and his relentless drive to master every subject. He could appear arrogant, but underneath was the insecurity of a boy desperate to prove he was worthy of respect. And here's something most people don't know. Despite the old jokes about his height, Napoleon was actually average for his time, about 5'6" or 7, but he was stocky, with strong legs that carried him across muddy fields, and he had these piercing gray-blue eyes that everyone remembered. A classmate later wrote that when Napoleon stared at you, it felt like he was weighing not just your words, but your soul. The family's tight finances left lasting marks too. Letitia's lessons in frugality stayed with him forever. Even when he commanded vast armies, he still ate whatever was available, still scolded officers who wasted money on luxury, still patched his own clothes when he could. Those early years of feeling like an outsider, of having to prove himself every single day, that hunger never left him. By 1785, 16-year-old Napoleon had graduated as an artillery officer. While his fellow officers chased pleasure and spent money freely, Napoleon lived like a monk. In garrison towns like Valence, locals remembered seeing him walking home with bread under his arm, eating it cold in his sparse quarters. He survived on bread, cheese, and watered wine, often dining alone by candlelight, hoarding every coin to send back to his struggling family in Corsica. But here's where the story gets interesting and heartbreaking. For all his discipline and ambition, Napoleon was still a young man, with a young man's heart. And that heart led him to Désirée Clary. Désirée was everything Napoleon wasn't. Refined, wealthy, comfortable in society. She was the daughter of a successful Marseille merchant, and when Napoleon met her, he fell hard. His letters to her, the ones that survive, are painfully awkward and incredibly touching. In one, he wrote, "My heart is yours, though I fear I am unworthy of you." Can you imagine? This is the same man who would one day crown himself emperor, admitting to a young woman that he felt unworthy. He tried to impress her with his intellect, sending her reflections on history and quotes from classical authors. But you can feel his insecurity bleeding through every line. He was caught between desperately wanting to belong in her world and knowing he didn't. Not yet. The relationship never led to marriage, though Désirée's sister Julie would marry Napoleon's brother Joseph. Désirée herself would eventually become Queen of Sweden, while Napoleon's path led somewhere very different. These early romantic experiences reveal something crucial about Napoleon. For all his later confidence and authority, he carried deep wounds about belonging and worthiness. The boy who was mocked for his accent became a young man who feared he wasn't good enough for the woman he loved. That fear of not being enough, of being rejected, of being laughed at, it drove him. It made him hungry for achievement, for recognition, for a greatness so undeniable that no one could ever question his worth again. By the mid-1790s, something had changed. The awkward young officer was becoming Napoleon the General, and with that transformation came habits that would define him for the rest of his life. First, there was his incredible energy. Napoleon rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. He'd wake before dawn and immediately start working, writing orders, studying maps, dictating correspondence. His secretaries couldn't keep up. They'd watch him stride across rooms, words pouring out faster than they could write. But here's what's amazing. He could fall asleep anywhere, in carriages, at his desk, even during battles, and then wake up completely alert and ready to make life or death decisions. His relationship with food became almost comical. Campaign records show he'd eat standing up, scribbling notes between bites. He ate so quickly that food constantly stained his uniform. His favorites were simple: roast chicken, plain pasta, fruit. One aide remembered him grabbing bread straight from a soldier's knapsack, tearing off a piece, and walking away without a word. He loved cherries and had this habit of chewing licorice during tense moments. Imagine Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz, making tactical decisions while working on a piece of licorice root. But it was his appearance that really made him legendary. While other generals dressed in elaborate uniforms dripping with gold braid, Napoleon wore a simple gray overcoat and his iconic bicorn hat. It wasn't a fashion statement, it was practical. But those simple clothes became his trademark. Soldiers could spot him from across a battlefield, and his presence alone could change morale. Here's where Napoleon gets really interesting psychologically. He was deeply superstitious while being incredibly practical. He talked constantly about his lucky star and believed destiny was guiding him. Before battles, he'd tell officers that the stars favored them. But he also personally inspected artillery, memorized terrain, and obsessed over supply lines. He believed in fate, but he prepared for everything. What made him magnetic to his soldiers wasn't just his brilliance, it was how he combined the extraordinary with the ordinary. He shared their hardships, ate their food, knew their names, but he also seemed touched by something larger than life, like destiny itself was on his side. December 2nd, 1804, Notre Dame Cathedral. Napoleon takes the crown from Pope Pius VII and places it on his own head. The message was clear. His authority came from his own hand, not from God or tradition. But what was life really like for the man behind this dramatic gesture? As emperor, Napoleon's daily routine was almost monastic in its intensity. He rose before dawn and immediately threw himself into work. Picture this: multiple secretaries standing around him, taking dictation as he switched between military orders, legal reforms, and personal instructions, sometimes mid-sentence. His concentration was terrifying. Ministers dreaded meetings with him because he'd drum his fingers impatiently if they hesitated, even briefly. His one indulgence? Long, hot baths, sometimes twice a day. He'd soak in steaming water while dictating memoranda to nervous attendants holding quills. He claimed it soothed his aches and cleared his mind. Even as Emperor of the French, he found peace in those quiet moments surrounded by hot water and steam. Despite ruling over millions, his personal tastes remained simple. He still wore that gray coat and bicorn hat, even at court events where everyone else dressed in silk and gold. Courtiers whispered that he looked more like a soldier than a monarch, but Napoleon saw that as strength. His meals were famously brief, sometimes 15 minutes before he'd jump up and return to work. He preferred simple food and wine diluted with water, and he got annoyed when courtiers fussed over elaborate dishes. But here's what humanizes him. He was still playful. He teased his staff with earthy humor and had this habit of affectionately pinching people's ears, both endearing and slightly intimidating. He doted on Josephine's little dog, Fortune, even after the mischievous spaniel bit him on their wedding night. These glimpses of warmth made his intimidating presence bearable. The contrast is striking. The man who crowned himself emperor worked not from a golden throne, but from a desk piled high with papers, surrounded by the controlled chaos of running an empire. Now we need to talk about Napoleon's darker side, because understanding his flaws makes his achievements more remarkable, not less. His temper was legendary and terrifying. He could explode without warning, shouting, slamming his fist on tables, lashing out at marshals and ministers who had served him faithfully for years. Then, just as suddenly, he'd calm down, sometimes apologizing minutes later. Officers admitted they entered his presence with both admiration and dread, never knowing if they'd meet the brilliant strategist or the furious tyrant. Those childhood insecurities never left him. Even as emperor, he remained defensive about his origins. He'd snap at courtiers who questioned his manners or breeding, still hearing the echoes of boys who had mocked his accent. His handwriting tells the story, rapid, uneven, almost illegible. He wrote like he was racing his own thoughts, impatient to capture ideas before they vanished. Secretaries struggled with ink blots and half-formed sentences, clear evidence of a mind that moved faster than his hand could follow. But it was in love that Napoleon revealed his most vulnerable side. His relationship with Josephine broke him open in ways that conquest never could. He adored her completely, sending passionate letters while away on campaign. But she betrayed him repeatedly, and each affair wounded him deeply. When he finally divorced her in 1809 for failing to provide an heir, witnesses saw the Iron Emperor stumble from the room with tears in his eyes, his voice breaking as he announced the decision. He later admitted he never stopped loving her, even after marrying Marie Louise of Austria, a political match designed to secure his dynasty. He kept Josephine's portrait close by. His second marriage was dutiful rather than passionate, and it left him lonelier than before. In private moments, he confided to aides that his heart remained with Josephine. The man who conquered Europe couldn't conquer his own heartbreak. This is what makes Napoleon so fascinating. His contradictions were stark and unsettling. He could sacrifice thousands of soldiers for strategic advantage, yet privately he was deeply sentimental, prone to nostalgia about Corsica or his early days with Josephine. He distrusted everyone, suspecting betrayal constantly, yet craved loyalty and affection from those close to him. He berated his marshals for hesitation, then shared intimate moments with them, asking about their families and reminiscing about old battles. Even at the height of his power, he feared abandonment. The insecurity of that mocked boy from Corsica never disappeared. Sometimes it seemed like every crown he wore was weighed down by the laughter of children who had once dismissed him as nothing special. After his abdication in 1814, Napoleon was sent to Elba, and here's where his character reveals itself most clearly. Instead of brooding over his fall, he threw himself into being a miniature emperor. He organized parades for an audience of peasants, reformed agriculture, improved roads, even oversaw olive oil production. Locals were alternately amused and bewildered by the sight of Europe's former master fussing over village details. But Napoleon without command was no Napoleon at all. After less than a year, he escaped, landing back on French soil to begin the famous 100 Days. There's a legendary moment when troops were sent to arrest him, and Napoleon faced them with his chest bared, declaring, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." Instead of arresting him, they rushed forward to embrace him. It was pure Napoleon. Theatrical, risky, and somehow irresistible. The 100 Days ended at Waterloo in 1815, and this time the Allies were taking no chances. Saint Helena was chosen precisely because escape was impossible. A tiny island, 6,000 miles from France, surrounded by nothing but ocean. At Longwood House, Napoleon's world shrank to a damp, drafty residence and a small garden. His body began failing him. He grew heavy, moved slowly, suffered constant stomach pain. But his mind remained sharp, and he used it to fight his final battle, the battle for his legacy. He quarreled constantly with his British jailers over dignity and protocol. He demanded the respect due an emperor while bristling at being treated as a prisoner. He took long walks in his garden, that familiar bicorn pulled low, muttering about past victories. To pass endless days, he played cards, read voraciously, and most importantly, dictated his memoirs. This is where Napoleon became his own historian. He embellished victories, downplayed defeats, and crafted the legend he wanted posterity to remember. Las Cases, who later published these conversations as the Memorial of Saint Helena, captured a Napoleon who was part truth-teller, part myth-maker, and entirely human. As his health declined, nostalgia surfaced more often. He spoke tenderly of Josephine, called her the great love of his life. He asked constantly about his son, the King of Rome, whom he longed to see but never would. He told stories to his companions, sometimes charming and witty, sometimes sulky and withdrawn. One evening he'd laugh about soldiers sharing cherries on campaign. Another day he'd fall silent for hours, staring at Josephine's portrait. By 1821, his strength was fading. His walks grew shorter, his writing less frequent. But he clung to ritual, putting on that gray overcoat each morning, arranging papers on his desk, dictating small orders to no one in particular, anything to preserve the rhythm of command. On May 5th, 1821, he died at age 51, officially of stomach cancer, though rumors of poisoning persist. Those present described him murmuring about France, his army, and Josephine until the end. 2 centuries later, Napoleon still defies easy judgment. To some, he's the tyrant who plunged Europe into endless war. To others, he's the visionary who modernized law, education, and government. His legacy swings between these extremes because the man himself was never one thing alone. His military genius is undeniable. His campaigns are still studied in academies worldwide, but his ambition often blinded him. The disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 showed how brilliance and overreach could march hand in hand, destroying his Grande Armée in the frozen wasteland. Politically, he's equally complex. The Napoleonic Code remains a foundation of modern law, enshrining equality before the law and merit over birth. His educational reforms created systems that still exist today. But alongside progress came censorship, concentration of power, and ruthless suppression of opposition. What makes Napoleon endlessly fascinating is how human he remained despite his extraordinary circumstances. He was shaped by childhood insecurities that never left him, driven by a need to prove himself that bordered on obsession, capable of great tenderness and terrible cruelty, sometimes within the same day. On Saint Helena, he once reflected to Las Cases, "What a novel my life has been." That observation still rings true. His story endures because it's fundamentally human, the tale of someone who refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on him, who insisted on remaking the world rather than accepting his place in it. Looking back on Napoleon's journey from the mocked boy in Corsica to the exile dictating his memoirs on St. Helena, what strikes me most is how recognizably human his struggles were. The insecurities, the need for recognition, the fear of not being good enough, the desperate desire to control his own story. These aren't the traits of some distant historical figure. They're the struggles we all face, just played out on the grandest possible stage. Napoleon forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ambition, power, and human nature. How much should we sacrifice for greatness? What's the difference between confidence and arrogance? Between leadership and tyranny? How do we judge someone who achieved remarkable things through often terrible means? He reminds us that history's greatest figures aren't superhuman. They're human in the most intense way possible, with ordinary feelings and fears amplified to extraordinary proportions. The boy who was laughed at for his accent became the man who made Europe tremble. The awkward young officer who feared he wasn't worthy of love, became the emperor who demanded the world's attention. Perhaps that's why Napoleon's story still captivates us. In our own age of ambition and insecurity, of social media and constant comparison, of feeling like outsiders, trying to prove we belong, Napoleon's struggles feel surprisingly contemporary. He achieved everything he dreamed of, and more, yet he never escaped the fundamental human need to be understood, respected, and remembered. From the pomp of his coronation to the loneliness of Saint Helena, Napoleon's life was a mirror, reflecting both the power and the danger of refusing to accept limitations. He shows us what's possible when someone refuses to stay in their assigned place, and what it costs to reach for immortality. The man who once held Europe in his hands ended his days arguing about wallpaper and writing letters to no one in particular. But even then, even there, he was still Napoleon, still trying to shape how history would remember him, still believing in his own destiny, still that ambitious boy from Corsica who looked at the world and decided he was meant for something greater. In the end, perhaps that's Napoleon's greatest achievement. Not the battles won or the laws written, but the sheer audacity of believing that one person could reshape the world through force of will alone. Whether we admire him or condemn him, we can't ignore him. And maybe that's exactly what he would have wanted. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Napoleon's life. If this exploration of the human side of history moved you, please follow History Crossroads for more stories where the myths of the past meet the questions of the present. Because understanding the people behind the legends doesn't diminish their importance. It makes them more remarkable, more relevant, and more human than we ever imagined.